Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Macro 2.0, a discussion about big ideas, big institutions, and big money. And with me, as always, is Mr. Nielsen, certified financial analyst from Opportunity Bank. Barry, thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
Last time we got started on trade policy matters, and as always, in a short time frame, it's hard to go in very deep and stay very long in any topic. There are a couple things we didn't get to that I just want to mention briefly at the outset of this program. We talked about big ideas in trade like free trade and fair trade and other ideas, comparative advantage. We didn't really get to any of the institutions that are currently of great interest, great import, even if they're not of great interest to a lot of Americans. One of them is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which now has a new moniker. It's been revised fairly substantially to be the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It was signed at an historic meeting not too long ago, a few months ago, by the presidents of Mexico, the United States, and the Prime Minister of Canada. Now it's up to the respective parliaments, congresses of those three countries to ratify it. So that's going to take a while. It's meant to take a while. But I'm mentioning it here now because Montana economy is very much affected, especially with the relationship with Canada. We import a lot of energy, we export some products. They're our number one trade partner in this part of the world, as anyone would guess, being a border state. So down the road, there'll be a lot to learn and say and comment on with respect to that agreement. The other institution I wanted to bring to our conversation is the Group of 20, otherwise known as G20. Sounds like a group of 20 countries, but it's a bit of a misnomer. It started out G7, 7 major industrial countries, including the United States and the major European countries. Now it's got to 20, but I have a few facts and figures to lay out just so people have a better understanding of the dimensions of G20, why it's so important. It was created to facilitate trade, also to bring finance ministers together to sort of resolve international financial problems, and there are always big money problems on the global front. But the G20 actually consists of 43 key countries in the world. 15 of them are outside the European Union, and 28 are countries inside the European Union. No, there are 28 members. So 4 of those member states in the EU have double representation at the G20. That's how it gets to 43. But it includes, of course, the US, China, Russia, the big European countries, India, South Africa, Brazil, and collectively we're talking about an organization representing, I have to look at my notes, 64% of the world's population and 85% of global GDP. So even though it's relatively unfamiliar to most of us in this country, it's a big deal, and when the G20 meets, big things result, big announcements. And that's our segue to our topic of the day, which is China, and what it means to the US economy, what it means more locally to the macro economy of our region. Very recently, there was a G20 meeting in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and that's where the president of China and the president of the United States briefly met. Well, actually, they met for a couple of hours and came forth with an announcement that the current trade war, which is ramping up rapidly, and we'll talk about what that means, was going to be put on hold to sort of give both countries some breathing room, 90 days, to re-enter negotiations and try to settle in a non-injurious way the trade war that's pitting the U.S. against China, their unfair trade practices, our tariffs, as a lever to try and get them to stop behaving badly, and breaking the rules of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which we'll talk about a little bit too. So, with all that as introduction, the main idea we wanted to broach today is mercantilism, or in its modern form, state capitalism, which ironically is what China has adopted as its philosophy. Capitalism, but run by the People's Republic of China government, a nominally communist government. And then the American response to that, which has many aspects of state capitalism itself. So let's start with your own view right now in general terms of what China signifies, what state capitalism means, and what you think about it.
Well, as I've expressed throughout our programs from the beginning, I'm a very strong believer in free markets, in that it is only free market capitalism that has proven to and can produce long-term wealth and increase of standard of living and raise people out of poverty. And I think that that's undisputable. We've seen that in the last 200 years at work. Those countries, those nations, those governments that opt for free market policies, principles, and adopt them, adhere to them, thrive and outperform, if you will. Having said that, perhaps someone could make the argument that the centrally planned economy of China has done extremely well in the last, call it 25 years, and is now approaching, in terms of, as measured by GDP, the largest economy in the world. I'm not sure where the U.S. economy stands exactly in relationship, as measured by GDP, to the Chinese economy, but
yeah. There's
number
people
one,
are very close.
Number one, too, for sure at this point, I believe. Having said that, I very much believe that that centrally planned success of the Chinese economy cannot and will not persist, just simply because a centrally planned economy cannot allocate resources nearly as efficiently as a free market capitalistic economy, where millions, tens of millions, 100 million different people, business owners, investors, are all putting their talents, their life savings on the line, their hard work on the line to find a better way to do things. Now, having said that, some of those, as we know, some of those people are not going to succeed, and sometimes a lot of those people are not going to succeed, and free market economies are prone to bubbles and periods of excess and irrational behavior. But in the end, left to function on their own, they will produce more long-term, sustainable wealth and a better standard of living than can simply happen by a group of individuals making those big economic decisions and really manipulating, be it their currency, interest rates, modes of production, very big aspects of the economy, like happens in a centrally planned economy like China.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to intervene here and sort of take the role. I pretty much agree with you in principle almost all the time, and I still do. But I'll be the advocate for China's alternative for the moment. You mentioned free market capitalism. What the Chinese seem to have not invented, but have grown to a huge scale, is not free market capitalism. It's state capitalism, meaning something different than the centrally planned economy of old. The Chinese and the Soviet Union were definitely like textbook centrally planned economies, and we know the Soviet Union was unsustainable. It imploded. The Chinese, in their wisdom of the ages, adopted capitalist-type reforms. One regime ago, Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, when he was head of the country, said we have to liberalize and become more like the West in order to sustain economic growth. So a lot of freedom was allowed in the marketplace, not in political terms, but just in terms of economic behavior. And that really launched China on its trajectory to be rapidly growing, feeding its people, employing its people, and becoming what it is today, this economic juggernaut. However, most of those reforms have been set aside by the current regime with President Xi Jinping, who's now the most powerful man on the planet by everybody's measure, because there's no term limits on his power. So in a sense, they're moving back toward that central planning-like structure. And then the other thing I'll mention, and see what you think about this, you know, in our system, in our way of doing business in the world, yeah, there are these bubbles, there are crashes. A lot of people suffer when that happens, and the market fails them. Even if it succeeds in the aggregate, it's failing somebody sometime or all the time. And irrational behavior enters in. So I'm going to posit that America's response to China's current wave of cheating by by preventing access to their markets, limiting by various means, requiring technology transfer when American companies or others go in and invest, they're required to give up technology, they're stealing secrets, they have no regard for intellectual property, all these things that we have against China. The behavior of our country right now to try and bring them to the table and get them to stop these deeply structured ways of doing business, unlike our own, is to impose radically broad-range tariffs. And I think I know pretty much your general outlook on the merits of tariffs as a means of gaining fairness in the market, but tell me what you're thinking about that now. And if you've thought very much about the way we're attacking China or counterattacking China with tariffs to try to get them to change into something other than what they are in their behavior.
Well, I think that there's no doubt that they do not practice fair trade, and that and it's very easy and popular and perhaps right to say at some point we have to put an end to that. On the other hand, as we talked about, I think in our last program, if they want to sell us products that I'll say are below market, or because of wages and the cost of labor in China, they're able to produce at a much lower price than we can produce here in the U.S. currently. We should be, as consumers, we should say that's great. Why are we punishing them for that? Because I go back to an example I think I used last time. If they want to sell us something that costs, they can produce for half the cost that it would take us to produce that same item here in the U.S., let's take it. And then we'll use that extra, if it costs $1 for them to produce it, but it cost us $2, let's buy it for $1. Then we use that dollar that we save and we can go do something else with it, whether we invest in production in some other good here in the U.S., or we consume something else here in the U.S.
Yeah. Invest in higher value products and services.
That's right, and we do a great job of that in the U.S. because we are innovators. And if they want to waste their time protecting industries in China, let them do that, because they fall behind. It doesn't seem so in the short term, but in the long term, when they force innovation upon us, we come out ahead. And just the products that we produce in the U.S., the innovative products, I think that it's accurate to say that we are the world's leader in innovation, be it fracking for oil, whether you agree with that or not. That is a huge innovation that turned us from a net importer of oil and oil-related products. I saw just today, for the first time in our history, we are a net exporter, not just of crude oil, but of all oil-related products. That's attributable to fracking. And we did that probably because of, this isn't China-related, but probably because of the OPEC cartel that kept oil prices so high for so long that allowed our producers to go for it and figure out a better way.
Yeah.
And I think that applies to China.
Yeah,
in a similar way.
When we did talk about this last time, thinking about along these lines that that Americans benefit from access to relatively cheap goods. We won't talk about services; they're less tradable anyway. But I think of just Walmart as an example. Walmart wouldn't exist probably if there weren't an extensive amount of trade between the United States and China. There's so many of these things that are made in China. And a lot of people see that and resent it and think, well, why isn't this made in the US? Well, because it would be incredibly expensive to make that same good here rather than there. And importing that, again, frees up capital to invest in other things.
Let me go back just real quickly. Let me go back to an example we talked about last time, I think, is a dress shirt. Well, forever we did not produce a dress shirt in the United States because of the cost of labor. They've all been produced in an Asian country or a Caribbean country, and we could not compete on the cost of labor. But what did that do? That forced us to innovate, and now I couldn't name the name of the company, but I read about it. There's a company that has totally, through robotics, automated the production of a dress shirt. And now they can compete with that cheap labor from other nations.
Yeah.
And who knows, 5 years from now, maybe every dress shirt in the U.S. is going to, or every dress shirt sold in the U.S. is going to be made in the U.S. through robotics. So it forces innovation. It really does. And I believe that they want to do that. Well, we're going to find a better way, and you stick to those policies, and we're going to pass you by.
Yeah.
But maybe that's my patriotic view, belief in the American system and in the American industry and innovation.
Again, not disagreeing with you, but I want to just throw this back a little bit more on the tariff question, because it's become a big issue. We're talking about massive amounts of tariffs on many, many products. And what I think a lot of us American consumers and producers don't realize is that tariffs on goods imported from China are actually costing Americans, South Koreans, Taiwanese, all these other countries are involved in global value chains or production chains. So many sophisticated products, and I mean, electronics, for example. We already mentioned the iPhone last time. It's a classic example. Those are constructed in about half a dozen different countries. So when the tariff is on the finished product, that is actually, China is the last leg in that chain. So what I'm trying to illustrate is choosing tariffs as a weapon against unfair trade practices, and everybody knows they are. The whole world is trying to figure out how to deal with China and its own convoluted set of rules that don't really rely on private property, on intellectual property. They have just different principles at work, and it's structurally quite different. And we're expecting them. I think the policy of the country is to hit them with hard tariffs with the prospect that that's going to force them to negotiate with us and change their way of doing business. We can't say whether that's going to come true or not. The other dimension, this is what I want to throw back into your financial mental world, is the tariffs are creating such uncertainty in American industry and global industry. Nobody knows how long they're going to last, how injurious they're going to be to agriculture and other sectors. And in an uncertain world, capital, money, finds its way into the United States. China is deeply worried about capital flight from China because of our tariffs. So we are still, for all the reasons you've kind of illustrated, the successful country. Money will come to the United States at a time when people are worried about slowdowns in growth, instability in the market. And the ironic consequence of these tariffs is driving the value of the dollar up. So flood of foreign capital investment, I mean, it's mostly liquid capital, drives the value of the dollar up. What does that do to our exports and our trade balance? It makes it worse. So there's this weird kind of perverse irony based on our relative strength and prosperity and the confidence that the rest of the world has in the United States, our rule of law. Businesses, know they're not going to get taken over, as happens in China. So what do you think about that?
Well, I agree with what you've said, and I think what we should agree on is that if one wrong, that wrong being unfair trade practices by the Chinese, us putting tariffs on them in retaliation, two wrongs don't make a right. They never has.
Yeah. It's not a win-win.
No.
Or even a win.
So, I would agree with that. And again, I think sometimes you just have to take a little bit longer term perspective. I don't know how relevant this is, but I'll say it. I mean, it took us, 80 years to defeat the Soviet Union, and we did that by demonstrating our economic might.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'd take 80 years to prove that free market capitalism will win out in the end over, as you called it, state capitalism, which I'm sure there's a distinction in there somewhere between state capitalism and communism. Although the biggest capitalist in China, Jack Ma, the richest person in China, just declared himself to be a communist.
Yeah.
And who wouldn't? Because if you don't, then their state social credit system that they're rolling out, he might not be able to leave the country unless he did.
Yeah.
So I think that, again, it might take several years and lots of maybe some self-doubt, but we have proven through 200 years of history, not just us, the British and Western Europe in general, that I don't think you can defeat capitalism let's call it an economic war.
Yeah. Well, actually, I find it very refreshing to have you say, take the long view. We should take the long view, because a lot of critics of current American policy say, we're too short term. The Chinese take the long view. They think in terms of centuries. We have resilience in our system too. I'm agreeing with you, of course, that time will tell, and the Chinese model is not being adopted hither and yon. I mean, a lot of people are being asked to adopt China's model of state capitalism for their own, and they compare it. The Chinese compare it to the United States. They say, look at the political morass of democracies versus our authoritarian capitalism. Very efficient, works very well, but we know there's all kinds of weaknesses behind the scene. And as always, we've exhausted our time, but I do want to ask you one more question, more general. You're in the financial business. You're analyzing bonds, and you know a lot about China's role in purchasing our treasuries, for example. In your day-to-day work with Opportunity Bank, are you compelled to think about, read about, and make decisions that involve Chinese money or Chinese institutions?
Well, I watch interest rates very, very carefully. That's a big part of my job. And so, yes, on two fronts. First of all, I want to understand what the strength or what's going on in the Chinese economy might do to the global economy and interest rates in general. I mean, it's a global economy, and if China falters, I mean, we've talked about these things. They have a huge debt bubble there, huge debt.
Yeah.
Their debt to GDP ratio, total debt to GDP ratio there surpasses the U.S. Different forms of debt than we have in the U.S., but yes, so, and I believe at some point that's going to collapse, and it will expose a very inefficient system there, very inefficient allocation of resources that's taken place. So I'm very concerned about that. When that happens, if it happens, what's it going to do to the global economy and then to interest rates here in the U.S.? And then we've talked about this. They can weaponize our debt, if you will. They hold a tremendous amount of U.S. Treasury bonds, our federal debt. What happens to interest rates here in the U.S. if they start to sell those bonds? Now, they hurt themselves when they do that, but you know, it's a matter of supply and demand. They put supply on the market, into the marketplace, and that causes interest rates here in the U.S. to go up. And it has a lot of other implications for currency values and trade in general. But yes, so I watch, with respect to China, those are two things that are on my radar screen on nearly a daily basis.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I'm going to make a prediction.
Okay.
With no basis of knowledge, but it's going to be on your radar screen even more as the months progress. Because
I think you're right.
This trade war, it's a weird thing. We're partners and rivals at the same time.
Sure.
And it's like a yin and yang relationship. We're more and more tightly integrated with product chains and all this, and investments, companies operating in both countries, and yet we're in a major public battle with them over their way of doing trade versus our way of doing trade. And as always, we've barely touched the surface of a very complex subject, but thanks for being here to talk about it. We'll be back next time to talk about an even more complicated and exotic thing, cryptocurrencies. So join us next time for that episode.